Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Beth Massura. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior marketing operations consultant at Atumos and a Marketo Champion. And so I'm excited to share with you today some of the information. Oh, goodness, my mouse does that sometimes. Sorry, folks. Some information that we've gathered about executable campaigns, what they are, how to use them, any tips and tricks for how to make the most of these. So first I'll talk about what are executable campaigns, and I have three analogies that hopefully will resonate with you and help you grasp the concept. It's a little bit different from other things in Marketo. I'll talk through the logic of how they operate, as well as those caveats and kind of tips that I mentioned, what you need to know as you are delving into them, and then a few different use cases and examples that you can try out. And at the end, I would love to hear from anybody else who's had a chance to play with these, and if there's anything that you'd like to share that you've been working on. So what are executable campaigns? They're a different type of smart campaign. So you might be familiar with trigger campaigns and batch campaigns. This is kind of a third category. And they're actually executed or called by a separate trigger or batch parent campaign. So they don't really do anything in themselves. They can't kind of start themselves. They have to be executed by another campaign. So I try to think of it as being a saved set of flow steps that runs as a whole before continuing on to the next flow step in the parent campaign. So parent campaign's flow step is it's going to execute a campaign. Once that executable campaign is completed in full, it'll come back and move to that next flow step. So here's the first of my three analogies. It's just kind of like a partial recipe. So a lot of times I'll see something like, see page 45 for this pie crust recipe, or see page 22 for the dumpling dough, soup base, etc. There's a lot of things where there's kind of a standardized component of a recipe, and you'll probably see it in multiple recipes. So the same pie crust applies to your chocolate pie, your apple pie, etc. So it doesn't need to be incorporated into the chocolate pie recipe, the apple pie recipe, but rather have its own page in the cookbook. So that reduces the number of ingredients or steps that you have to account for in that single recipe page. So instead of listing all these different steps like this on the chocolate pie page, it just says, go see this other page for the pie crust and then come back when you're done, right? So it just kind of keeps things a little cleaner. And since it's going to be the same across all the pies, no need to repeat it. It also allows some consistency then, so that you have one kind of pie crust. And you don't have to worry about, well, wait a minute, how come this one has a little bit more flour or something? Or wait, this one doesn't have sugar. Why is that? So it's providing kind of a consistent experience across all these different recipes that use it. And then the last piece that fits into the analogy is that you can better manage any necessary order of your cooking. So you can't really fill a pie until you have the pie crust ready. So you want to make sure that the crust is completed. You followed all of these steps in that particular recipe before you continue with your chocolate pie. So that was one kind of piece that I thought might help make this a little bit more real for folks. The next one is having a standard operating procedure or plan. So this is more maybe business-based, or I started out trying to think about like, oh, some sort of CIA special operations type thing, but that started getting too complicated. But overall, it's kind of the idea of you've got almost like a checklist of here's exactly what needs to happen when somebody invokes this plan. So if you're at work and you are supposed to follow some procedure to, shut down a particular piece of machinery, there's going to be a checklist of things you need to do. And if you are tasked with shutting down that piece of machinery, you have to follow this plan start to finish. You can't say, okay, well, I'll do this, and maybe I'll go wander off and I'll finish it up next day. That's probably not how the SOP is intended to be used. They want you to just do it start to finish, check that off, and then move on to the next thing for safety reasons or whatever. And you might also have a SOP or plan that has to do with repeatable steps. So maybe some factor is going to change. So maybe another example here that I abandoned was like if you have a plan for how to throw a birthday party, maybe the steps are all the same, but maybe you're swapping out whose birthday it is. So, you know, overall, things are going to be relatively consistent across everything, but you're going to switch out the factor of whose birthday is it, or maybe the theme of the birthday, but you're still going to buy your decorations and cakes and whatnot. You're just swapping out that one kind of factor or variable there. That's the second analogy I had. And the third analogy, video game level. Now, this is about the only game I know how to play. So this may not be the case with other games, but you need to start the game. The game level doesn't exist in a void. Like you have to actually start your game and then maybe you'll get up to the level. You have to finish level 1 before you can start level 2. So with there's kind of a continuation. You can't kind of jump around or miss parts, or you can't be playing level 1 and level 2 at the same time. And lastly, this is kind of a gotcha, but if a level glitches, you can't continue. So if I'm playing Super Mario Brothers and in the middle of jumping, I'm now frozen and nothing's happening, unfortunately, I'm probably going to have to stop the game, blow in the cartridge, and then try again. So if there's an issue, then I'm kind of stuck. So these are all analogies that I thought might help make the executable campaigns a little bit more tangible in terms of how they operate, some of the functionality, some of the use cases, and so on. So with that, here's kind of a rundown of some of the key benefits of executable campaigns, especially in comparison to just a typical trigger or batch campaign. So you can reuse those consistent flow steps. You can reduce the number of flow steps in a single campaign. As you may know, if you start getting 20, 30 more flow steps in a single campaign, the Marketo interface might take a while to load. So it just keeps it lean and mean. Unlike request campaign, which is another way of calling another campaign that's separate, it doesn't create another active trigger. So like I mentioned, the executables are just kind of sitting, waiting. They can't initiate anything on their own. You can ensure the processing order by using executable campaigns. A really neat one is that they inherit token values from the program that is where that other campaign that's calling it lives. And lastly, you can also log that a person didn't qualify for an executable campaign. So normally if you have like a trigger campaign and you have some filters to limit who can come through it, you're not going to know if somebody did the trigger activity but didn't meet that filter. There's just nothing on that person's record that will indicate that they did the trigger, but they just didn't qualify for that particular campaign due to the filters. So these all come into play in various use cases. But this is kind of setting the framework of like why do we even care? What is the purpose of these? And so next I'll kind of talk about some of the things to watch out for as you embark on this journey, because certainly there's a lot of neat things here, but I just want to make sure you understand any of the limitations or aspects that you might want to take into consideration. So when you're creating and using your executable campaigns, the option to make a campaign executable is only at the time of creation. So when you go and say, create new smart campaign, at the bottom of that little dialog box is a little checkbox that you have to check to make it executable. Now, happens to me a lot. I will forget to check that box. And now I have got a campaign that is not executable and you cannot switch it back. So then I have to create a new smart campaign. So just keep in mind that you have to select that at the get-go and you can't kind of switch between executable and trigger or batch. It's unlike where you have a trigger or batch campaign, depending on whether or not you have a trigger in the smart list tab. So just heads up about that. You can actually create an executable campaign from an existing campaign. So you can clone that existing campaign to copy all of its filters, all of its flow steps. But you need to strip out triggers and any prohibited flow steps, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So if I have a trigger campaign that exists today and I say, you know what, I want to reuse this, but I want to make it executable, I'm going to get this little error message saying that the campaign I'm attempting to clone contains unsupported rules or flow steps. So what I'd have to do is I'd have to remove that trigger first, or if you want to, you could clone it as is so that you don't delete the existing trigger campaign, then delete the trigger from that clone, and then clone that and make your executable campaign. So it's kind of like having to have this intermediary campaign copy in the meantime. But that would be a way if you have lots of complicated filters and advanced logic, lots of flow steps with flow step choices, it might be easier to have that intermediary campaign. So as I mentioned, the executable campaigns are very different. You can't have triggers on them too. So when you have a request or campaign is requested trigger on a trigger campaign, you can be that single campaign can either be triggered by, say, a form fill or a data change and be requested by another campaign. But that only applies to those trigger campaigns and request campaign triggers. So unfortunately, you can't say that the executable campaign itself is executable and it's triggered. Unfortunately, you have to pick one way or the other. You would need to have a separate campaign that contains the trigger in order to accomplish that. Likewise, you can't schedule or run a single batch of an executable campaign. You'd have to have a separate campaign that you can then schedule and run and have it execute that campaign. So with that being said, executable campaigns are always on. So there's no activation. They look the same whether or not they are being executed by anything else. But of course, you can always check a use by tab to see if anything is actively executing it. Next point is that your executable campaign must be in the same workspace as the parent campaign or campaigns that are going to execute it. Now, not a lot of folks still like to use workspaces in Marketo, but if you do have that set up in your instance, just be aware of that. So you need to create them in that same workspace. Now, you can have multiple campaigns executing the same executable campaign. That's definitely part of the use case or part of the benefit, but they all have to live in the same workspace. Lastly, you can actually use a smart list or use the smart list of the executable campaign to limit who's going to actually run through the executable campaign once that campaign has been invoked. So once something else is executing it, you can still filter it down further, just to make sure that nobody's slipping through that you don't want to actually run through the executable campaign. And so to accomplish that, it's actually recommended that instead of just, because these are always on, right? There's no pausing or whatnot or activating, rather than dropping in filters directly to the smart list tab on the executable campaign, where you pull in this field must contain this value. When you first pull it in, it's empty, right? You have to configure it. And in the meantime, it's got a little red squiggly line that's saying it's basically invalid. So to avoid having anyone try to run through the executable campaign while you're in the middle of updating the filters, it's actually recommended to use a member of smart list is, and then have a fully configured smart list ready to go. So that if you do need to make changes to the criteria of who you want to gate for that executable campaign, there's less likely of a chance that it's going to, that somebody's going to get kind of lost in the meantime. So it helps avoid those potential errors. So here's some tips around flow steps. So we were talking about how to create and kind of set up the front end of the executable campaign. So what about flow steps? So a lot of flow steps are perfectly valid to use. You can use data change values, but here's a few that you want to be aware of. So you can't call a webhook. So that would be typically an external vendor, maybe an enrichment vendor or some other data system that you want to connect to when something happens with a record. You cannot put that call webhook into the executable campaign. It won't actually show up as an option. So if you do need to involve a webhook at some point, what you can do is in your executable campaign, have a flow step to request a separate campaign that then calls the webhook. So that would be requesting a more traditional trigger-based campaign that can call the webhook. But once you do that, you're no longer, it's no longer part of the guaranteed completion component of the executable campaign. So, you know, unfortunately, that whatever happens with the webhook and waiting for the response isn't guaranteed to finish before the parent campaign moves on to the next flow step. But that's a way to still incorporate webhooks. As a heads up, remove from flow is still an option, but want to make sure that you're aware that when you use that, it's not going to remove them just from the executable campaign's flow steps. It actually removes them from the parent campaign too, and that's kind of a surprise. So, and the whole sequence, the whole level. So if an executable campaign is executed by another executable campaign, and then that has a parent campaign, remove from flow removes them from all, which may not be what you want to have happen. So just be aware of that. While it would be lovely, at this time, you cannot tap into the program member custom fields for the parent program. So I know some folks are interested in stamping program member custom fields, but unfortunately, if you execute a campaign, it won't be able to interact with those. I kind of referenced to, or alluded to this, but you can have up to 3 layers of executable campaign. So what does that mean? You have an executable campaign, executes another campaign, executes another campaign, and all of that is ultimately either called by a batch or trigger campaign. I've got a nifty little diagram on the next slide that looks complicated, but will actually take all these things into consideration. So with this constraint, you just want to think through, like, what's the best way to configure them so that I can best take advantage of executable campaigns' unique capabilities. So given that you can control processing order, given that, you know, it has these certain characteristics around inheriting tokens and whatnot, what should be in an executable campaign, and maybe what is fine to have in a traditional trigger or batch campaign directly. So that way you can save the executable campaigns for what really needs it. So here's my little diagram. This kind of takes all of the different things that I was mentioning and puts it into a visual. So around what's allowed, what's not allowed, how many layers of executable campaigns you have. They always start with a trigger or batch campaign. You can see here. And then what's going to be completed before other steps. So I have some call-outs about, like, what's going to happen first, what is not necessarily going to happen, etc. So you can kind of follow this along, use it as a reference. So I think we'll have like a PDF of the deck or something that will be shared, so you can look at this when you need to. It's a lot where we don't have to go through all of the details right now. So let's talk some more about token inheritance, because that is a really great feature of executable campaigns and why they're valuable. So what that means is an executed campaign will actually get the token values from the parent campaign's program, so that it's actually going to be able to pull in from whichever parent campaign is causing it to happen right now. So if you have multiple campaigns all executing the same campaign, it's going to have the values from each of those individual programs depending on which one is executing it. So that's really awesome. So along with system tokens, so program tokens like program.name, trigger tokens, campaign tokens, member tokens, it can also inherit the custom my tokens that you create on a program or have inherited from the folder that the program is in. So all of these different types of token values are available to you. And the way that you can tell the executable campaign to take the token values from that parent campaign, from the campaign that's calling it, in your flow step where you have execute campaign, there's an option, use parent campaign token context. True means parent campaign tokens will come in. Otherwise, if you set it to false, that means that it will use the token values from the program that the executable campaign lives in. So these aren't necessarily all in the same program. you might have more of a centralized operational type program that's housing a lot of your executable campaigns. So that's why it matters what whether or not it's going to inherit tokens from the parent or not. If you do have this setting set to true, it's generally going to inherit from the top level program. So like I was talking about, you can have executable campaigns calling more executable campaigns. So if you have multiple levels, it's going to inherit from that initial trigger or batch campaigns program. So where can you actually use the values from these tokens in your executable campaigns? What I found for the most part is that it really works best in flow step stamping. So you say, copy this token value into this field, set the field value. That's really the best way to use them, and one of the only ways, really. So for example, anything where you might have to select a specific program from a dropdown, like acquisition program, unfortunately, it doesn't accept tokens. You wouldn't be able to set an acquisition program from a centralized executable campaign because it's just not built in that way. It's looking for you to select a specific program. I also noticed, and I tried again, I know I had said I would keep trying when I did talk on this about a year ago, but I cannot get the custom my tokens to inherit an email asset when you send the email from the executable campaign. For some reason, it still works to have a system token, so I could still get the program name of the parent program to populate in this email asset sent from an executable campaign, but it would not take my custom token. It would always stamp the value from the executable campaigns programs token. So that's kind of a bummer because I think that would limit it a little bit in terms of being able to centralize something like fulfillment emails, but could keep playing with it, or maybe it's a bug, I don't know. But it's kind of mixed results there in terms of whether or not they show up in an email asset. So again, stamping field values is definitely works for this token inheritance, but some other things may not work. So what does it look like when you are setting up the tokens for token inheritance? So we do recommend putting that same token name in both the parent program and in the child program where the executable campaign lives. So in this example, I've got a best practices ebook program. I've got some different local tokens for description of this ebook, like who's the email sender. Of course, those are the ones that weren't working when I was testing again. But like this is basically how it worked. And then in the executable campaigns program, here's the tokens that I have. So I'm repeating it. And so I have a content description, I have the email from address, etc. But you'll notice that the values are different. So the idea is that you could kind of have a backup value should for some reason the parent campaign be missing a value. So you'd at least have something there. So in this case, if I was going to stamp, you know, a custom field with this description, in this case, in my best practices ebook, if that were to execute the campaign, I get the best practices ebook provides lorem ipsum, blah, blah, blah. But if for some reason the parent campaign didn't have that token, it could at least have undefined content and just be a trigger for myself to know, oh, something's missing something. So you can put that same token name in the child program. Or I guess if they live in the same folder, they could inherit them too. It's another option. So this is a slide I had shared in the past, but it's basically a summary of some of the token inheritance. So again, this is kind of high level or maybe low, more complicated level. So we don't have to go through all the details here, but basically saying, okay, if I define the token in the parent program and I say use the parent campaign token context equals true, tokens defined here, what happens? So they can kind of follow along and see what should happen depending on what whether you use true or false, whether or not tokens appear in both the parent campaign program and the executable campaign program, etc. So it's kind of confirming some of the things that we would hope to have happen. And then, as I mentioned in this last example, unfortunately, the custom my tokens did not inherit in the email asset itself. So here's 3 general overall use cases for executable campaigns, given all these things about how they operate, the benefits, et cetera. The first one is going to be to control operational processing order. So when you have a bunch of different things you want to have happen to records, how do you make sure it's happening in the right order? So we'll talk about that. Next one we'll talk about is how to run multiple steps that are going to apply to a specific subgroup of records that are running through something. And then lastly, how to create repeatable processing where tokens can be used in flow steps. So we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. So the first use case is when you want to control the operational processing order. So a couple things that you would kind of gain by using executables is you can help eliminate daisy chains where you have campaign number 1, request campaign number 2 at the end of that. At the end of all those flow steps, it requests campaign number 3. At the end of those flow steps, requests campaign number 4, et cetera. It kind of reduces some insight into the order of things, and it's also a pain to update. If you're going to insert a new step, or if you're going to take away one of those steps, now you have to figure out how to reconnect them because now the chain's broken. Another aspect is that you can help avoid wait steps, which you might currently be using to try to hold the next process from starting until you finish up the first one. But they're kind of arbitrary anyway. How do you know exactly how long is it going to take? You don't want to wait too long. Like if it finishes right away, you don't want it to be sitting and waiting. And it also could be the case that it ends up taking a little longer than you expected, in which case it's not really accomplishing what you wanted. So just some examples. I kind of skipped over the examples from the last one, so let me go back there real quick. Oh, wait, no, this is the first one. Never mind. So some examples are standardizing country values before determining consent requirements. So if you care about things like CASL, GDPR, et cetera, and you want to make sure that based on their country, something happens to them, we want to make sure that those country values are all standardized so that you can evaluate them. Maybe you want to process their life cycle stage before syncing the record over to Salesforce. So, so that when sales sees the record for the first time, it's accurate. You might want to get data back from an enrichment service integrated with Salesforce before demographic scoring happens. So before you evaluate the traits of the person or the company. One little caveat there is notice that I say integrated with Salesforce. If you have an enrichment service that you're calling from Marketo through a webhook, as we talked about before, webhooks unfortunately don't take part in the executable campaigns, and thus you can't really take that into consideration with controlling the operational processing order. But you could potentially use it for waiting for Salesforce data to come back before it continues on to evaluate the person's closeness to their ideal customer profile. So here's some examples of we'll walk through exactly what this might look like. So for my example, I have new person processing, very common. There's a lot of things you want to have happen as soon as a record is entering your Marketo database. So in my example, I have a centralized program, new person processing, and these are the flow steps that I see in this new person processing trigger campaign. So first, it's going to call data standardization, then it's going to execute privacy compliance, and then it's going to sync it to Salesforce. So what is the order in which things will happen? Now, why do I have 1, 6, and 7? What happened to 2 through 5? Well, first it's going to execute data standardization. So let's see what are the flow steps in the data standardization campaign. Oh, look, more executables. Now, remember what we were saying is that you can actually nest the executable campaigns. So you can have an executable campaign call another executable campaign. So in our data standardization controller, which was called from that new person processing campaign, it's going to execute country standardization, and then it's going to execute state standardization. Now, why would we want to do that? So if we don't know what country they're in for sure, how are we going to know that the state is correct or what state it should be? So first, we're going to execute country standardization. That is executing another campaign, right? So that's why we're going from 2. This is what it's going to actually do. This is the this is the flow step that is in country standardization. So we have flow step choices, and it's saying if it's got that abbreviation, this is country, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to finish all that before it comes back over to the next executed campaign in our data standardization controller. So it makes sure the country is dealt with. Now it's going to go to state standardization. So then the next thing that happens, this is the flow step that is in state standardization. Same kind of thing. It's truncated here. I wasn't going to show all states, but if the state has this abbreviation, that's the name that should be stamped. All right. So we've standardized the country, we've standardized the state. So now what's going to happen? This campaign is done. It did everything that it was supposed to. So let's go back to our new person processing. Data standardization is all done. Now it can move on to the privacy compliance. So, and then once that's done, I'm not going to show all the details of what that goes into, but the same kind of thing. That might have its own flow steps that might call additional executable campaigns. So once all of that's done, then it will move on to execute the sync to Salesforce. So that kind of guarantees that all these other things are going to happen before it syncs to Salesforce. And make sure that it's got the right country values. You won't have sync errors. Make sure that you've determined what kind of consent you have for people before sales starts emailing them, things like that. So in a traditional world, before we had executable campaigns, you might have requested these campaigns if you didn't want to have 100 flow steps in one new person processing campaign. But when you request a campaign, it just shoots it off and it says, okay, I told them to do it. And then it immediately moves and requests the next campaign. So then you have data standardization, privacy compliance, and sync to Salesforce essentially happening in parallel, which is not what we wanted. So having the executable campaigns really, really helps us control the order in which all these things are happening so that we can use the data from the previous step to inform the next step. All right, so let's move on to the next use case, and that was subprocesses for specific subgroup. So if you have a campaign and a process that you want people to run through, but there's kind of a fork in the road. You say, well, if they meet this criteria, you want them to do this. Otherwise, we want them to do this other thing. That can be hard to control within a single smart campaign because it's not intended to have forks or branches. So you can use, I'm sorry, there's a little background noise. So you can use the executable campaigns to kind of serve as those forks in the road. And this helps you avoid repetitive flow step choice criteria, which I'll show in the next slide. And it'll also provide clarity into all the processing that will happen for that particular subgroup. So it'll show you, here's what's going to happen to fork A, here's what's going to happen to fork B in a more concise and clear way. So one example might be, what are all the steps that are going to happen for people who submit the preference form? Some of them have unsubscribed. What needs to happen to those people versus people who filled out that preference form and didn't unsubscribe? Two different paths. We want to kind of control that and make sure we understand what's going to be happening for those two different groups, even though they're coming from kind of the same activity. So in the past, you might have used flow step choice criteria. If they unsubscribed, okay, well, then we're going to do some things. Otherwise, do something else. But you'll notice we have the same flow step choice criteria for both of these. Both of them have if unsubscribed is true. So that's kind of redundant, right? And we also don't see in one view what happens if somebody unsubscribes. You don't see a clear picture of, okay, it's going to null the opt-in date and set an unsubscribe reason. Or what's going to happen to someone who filled this out and didn't unsubscribe? Oh, okay, we're going to stamp them and clear the reason, right? So especially if you had multiple additional flow steps here. So kind of is not ideal, but in the new world with executable campaigns, we can split this up a little bit easier. So we're going to have one flow step choice using the unsubscribed as true. And what we'll do is we'll execute a campaign that contains all the things that need to happen for the people who unsubscribe. And then we have a different executable campaign for all the things that need to happen if the person didn't unsubscribe. So it's sending them down the fork in the road and making it a lot cleaner. Now I can go look at this campaign and see exactly what happens for a person who unsubscribed and what happens exactly for that person who did not unsubscribe. So it just kind of allows me to have a little more visibility. I don't have to repeat the same flow step choice if statement across multiple things. So it's a little cleaner. Another use case was to create repeatable processing using tokens. So this would help with if you want to have your program engagement processing consistent across different programs. Certainly having program templates that you can clone and update for each marketing initiative that you have is super useful. But this might potentially take it a step even further, with the caveats of I was having trouble with the email asset. But this also allows you to leverage the program tokens like we talked about. So some examples might be stamping a custom field that captures the most recent program, maybe syncing to Salesforce if you use a Salesforce campaign token, setting timestamps, as well as centralized interesting moments, which is what I'll talk about specifically as an example. So I made this little chart before around, well, what kinds of common program steps can you easily translate into executable campaigns versus not? So the examples that I just shared using different tokens, those work well. And as I mentioned a little while back, unfortunately, things where you actually have to select a program, you can't use a token for that. So unfortunately, those don't work well for executable campaigns. And likewise, I was having some challenges with using custom my tokens in an email or alert specifically. So I put kind of a question mark because program tokens still work, system tokens still work, just not the custom tokens. So let's talk about a specific use case example for interesting moments. And I included a couple links at the bottom of this slide because if you aren't familiar with interesting moments, it's a feature that's part of Marketo Sales Insight, which allows some additional activities and things to be sent over for sales to be able to view. So interesting moments are basically a way to add a little line for sales like, hey, this person did something interesting. So if you want to do it, you want to have Marketo set up to capture certain activities that are valuable or important for sales to know about. And so if you haven't heard of these before, a couple resources there. So in the past, you might have just kind of stamped interesting moments on particular programs and kind of made that message custom. But this executable campaigns allow you to centralize them and make them a little more consistent in terms of what information is included, but do it in a scalable way because you're able to use tokens so that you aren't typing up something unique each time. And it's also going to be readable by the sales team, and we'll show it in the example what that means. And this allows you to expand beyond the trigger token specifically. And again, we'll kind of show an example of what that might look like because you can use the inherited custom program my tokens to get more useful information to sales. So for example, sales might find a friendly name for an asset that a person downloaded more useful than if you give them the asset name, which is following some naming convention like, content hyphen ABC 123. It's going to be abbreviated. It's not really something that's useful. Likewise, maybe you want to send a summary or description of what that asset was. So again, we're trying to translate what we can, what we have that person doing and interacting with Marketo, sending it over to sales. So here's 3 different kind of ways that you could create interesting moments. So the first one is you just have it hard-coded into your program campaign flow. So when somebody downloads your PDF, this is part of the trigger flow where this is just one of the flow steps in that. So here I just manually typed in a description. This person downloaded a PDF about centers of excellence. I think they like MOPS, marketing operations. So that's really useful to sales. Like that might provide some good context, but it's not very scalable. I have to go create this flow step and type in a flow step. I have to access the trigger campaign in every single program I create. So one way that I could start to centralize is if I have the second example where I'm using a trigger token. In the previous slide where I had some resources on interesting moments, there's a little more about that as well. It allows you to basically capture the asset name. So that's what I was talking about. You would have this abbreviation of, whatever naming conventions you use is what would appear here. But that might not be useful to sales. It's kind of nebulous. Well, what is this thing, ABC123? That doesn't mean anything to me. So the last example would be is if you have this in an executable campaign that's centralized and all the programs are calling it. Well, now you can inherit a custom token from the program that is referencing a content description. So now I can type in the downloaded PDF about Centers of Excellence just on the program token. I don't need to go into the campaign and modify it. All I have to do is update the token in the program, and it'll automatically come over here in what's being stamped in this interesting moment. So it's both more scalable and it's more helpful to sales than some of the old ways of doing things there. That's my third use case for interesting moments. So I wanted to share, there's a couple different resources if you want to learn more about executable campaigns. There's a couple blogs on the Marketing Nation, including one about interesting moments using executable campaigns. So I highly recommend checking those out. But the last few minutes that we have, I want to see if there's any immediate questions or things that people wanted to share. Feel free to put it in the chat.
Beth, that was an amazing overview. And yeah, if folks want to put questions in the chat, I'd be happy to help field them if there's a bunch. That was a really helpful reminder and overview for, I thought of how all of the different ways that you can use executable campaigns, especially the illustration of where you take very different types of operational processing and move from one to another in the new lead example. So
yeah, this is Heather. I want to say the same thing that Nate just did. That was really super helpful. And the token part of it, I hadn't really thought through very well. So that's great. It's really useful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Glad it's helpful. Yeah, if you haven't tried them yet, you could always start with small things, right? You don't have to totally convert everything you have into executable campaigns today. But if there's a use case for in a particular program, one component of your new person processing, give it a try and see how it is, and you can build upon it.
And if there aren't specific questions for Beth and you have a question about a process where you have a timing conflict or you're managing that now, feel free to put that out there. And Beth has run through, I think, so many different examples with this that she might have some insight into whether or not that's something you could solve with an executable campaign.
Hi, this is Bonnie, and I'm really new to all of this. So I was actually kind of curious how you might explain how different, and maybe you did, and this is over my head a little bit, but like how different this is from like requesting a campaign. Is it maybe that we're in a more simpler logic place? So it's not, I still don't understand how executable campaigns would be effective, because I see it being effective if maybe we had a lot more processing that needed to be done. So wanted to just double check.
Sure, and that's a great question. So I think the main difference is the running in parallel versus running in order. So if you have more than one flow step in your campaign that's requesting a campaign, all it does is request a campaign. It just says, hey, you got to do this thing, but then it moves on. It doesn't wait for, okay, great, you're done. Okay, now I'm going to continue. So that's the with request campaign, it's just going to push it out and then move on. But if you want to wait for that process to be done, then using executable campaigns will sit and listen for that other step to complete. So I think that's the main difference. The other difference, and in terms of like actual impact, I'm not positive of, but when you have a requested campaign, it actually has an active trigger. So it's sitting there kind of listening for things to happen. And I know if you have like a lot of active triggers, it can be hard to keep track of them and which ones need to stay on or which ones don't. And they can also turn themselves off. So if you haven't had anybody run through in 6 months, then there's actually a cleanup process that runs automatically by Marketo, which will say, oh, you're not getting anybody. We're going to turn you off to save on processing power. And so executables are always on. They aren't going to turn off. So that potentially could also come into play. But I think the main one is just controlling order in which things happen.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'll just put this out there. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. So I know they said, like, make sure you have consent. Please add me. I'm probably the only Beth Massura, so you should be able to find me. Happy to continue staying in touch and talking about executables.